webinar. Open access typically to gurus Tony and Scott, but today Tony was tight for a flight. He still managed to make his presentation segment of the webinar, but he had to literally fly. And so we tapped another senior consultant, a phenomenal faculty member, Dr. Patrick Rooney, who is going to fill in for Tony today and give some of his great perspectives so that you have 3 different perspectives for each question that you bring to us during the Q&A session. So just enter your questions into the text field of the webinar panel, and I'll be pleased to read them aloud for myself, Patrick, or Scott to respond. So let's start with the first one. This comes in from Joe. And this came in early in the presentation. Said, what are the top data preparation issues? I saw that landed before Scott did a phenomenal job covering a number of data preparation issues. But I like the second part of the question. I think we can expand on that a little bit. How do you best handle them on an ongoing basis? And I think Scott mentioned that, and I can start in by opening that up a little bit further, saying that you've got to document. And he had it on the slide. It said document, document, document. In our courseware, we have Excel workbooks. And when you hear Excel, you think analytics. And there is a small part of analytics that we do with the Excel workbook. But what the workbook is largely designed to do is to capture your notes, your progress in developing the overall 6-phase modeling process. So you establish your metrics. You record the interviews that you have, not just with leadership, but anybody who contributes to or draws from the analytic process, who's going to be involved with it. Those need to be outlined. And, of course, how you're going to do your data preparation, because at some point, even if you think that model's not going to be recognized or get a lot of attention, at some point your boss is going to come back to you and request something to be revised, or can you pull up that model again, and then you're going to think, oh my gosh, how did I transform that data? How did I prepare it? And there's going to be a lot of steps that you went through. And so one of the resources you get in the training is a comprehensive Excel workbook that can be your template to document all the things that you should record through all 6 phases of the model development process. So let me go out for any other advice, because like Scott said, it's the part of the process where you'll spend most of your labor, most of your time. These days, it may be the role of a different team player who's responsible for data preparation that can be parsed out now that there's more specialization. But Scott, anything to add as far as data preparation, and how do you handle data prep on an ongoing basis?
That's a very good question, Joe. I'll summarize it very quickly. I would probably place the 3 biggest areas in 3 buckets here. First of all, as we mentioned, outliers, data outliers. How do you deal with those? The second way has to do with missing values. You're going to have data that's not complete in any column or on any data file that you deal with. And the third way has to do with what we call transformations of scale. For example, if you're modeling a yes-no situation, most algorithms don't understand yes or no, so we actually convert those to numbers. So that's a high-level view of it. To get more direct to your question, whenever we do data transformations, those transformations, as Eric mentioned, are documented. It's very important to keep that documentation, and when we put a model in that everybody is satisfied with into production, in other words, in an ongoing executable fashion, then those transformations that we initially did become part of the process itself, and you implement them according to the documentation, the methodologies that you used when you were developing the model.
Great considerations. Thanks so much, Scott. And Patrick, thanks for coming into the event on such short notice. We're truly grateful, not only for reacting quickly, but for the experience you bring to the call. Would you like to extend to that, or would you like to be the first to respond to the next question?
You're quite welcome. I'm happy to be here. When I think of outliers, and if I think of doing more than one model, and if you're building models, you should always be building more than one model. You want to have programs or macros. I'm a big SAS programmer, so I use macros that can generalize to how you handle outliers. So, for example, I have macros that can handle any number of variables that automatically recode them to the 99th percentile and the 1st percentile, so you don't get wild values like 10 million, you kind of cut it off at like a 99th percent value, and you have a program that does that. So you don't have to keep reinventing the same program over and over. You can just reuse that code over and over for a whole variety of modeling projects. And I would say having a good organized sort of set of standard procedures, standard programs, macros, if you will, should be in every data modeler's, predictive modeler's toolbox.
But I can imagine the efficiency that brings as well once they're already built. That kind of filtration is set to go on ever more until you make any adjustments that you might see fit. That's fantastic. Thank you, Patrick. Tracy asks, what strategy should be employed to begin analyzing an environment that has both unstructured and multi-structured data? And I kind of alluded to that. I guess I was leading a little bit maybe, and I think Tracy's question was in first. My advice was, go for the low-hanging fruit, the high-value fruit with the structured data was my advice. But let's start with Patrick this time about any strategy when you're going into, I guess, what people call big data today, all the multi-structured data, the unstructured. What advice would you give to Tracy when you go into that, today's more modern, messy environment with data?
Well, for big data, I would be very sure that you have a very clear idea of what you're after. What's your objective? I know we keep hammering on that, but what are you really looking for? And then the first thing I always, go to is sampling. You don't need to analyze all the data. Once you figured out what question you want to answer, then you can usually get a pretty good idea of, sort of what's your unit of sampling. You don't really need to analyze all the data. Always look for a way to sample the data.
Great recommendation. And I agree. If you're just jumping into the data, you're starting a book, I think, on chapter 5. So it's to back up, and if you understand what you're really targeting, what are the problems you want to address first, then you can start to pick and choose what even makes sense to include. And you always want to include a little bit more. If it's a maybe, go ahead and throw it in because the model can oftentimes determine what has predictive value. But if you know what the objective is, a lot of times there's other data that just won't make sense for this particular problem. And like Patrick said, start your circle small and expand it out by sampling so that you get a good enough representation of the full solution space. Scott, would you like to extend?
Yeah, I'd like to underscore what Patrick said about sampling. One of the biggest mistakes that modelers make when they come into this is they think more is better. That we see that evidenced by the big data movement that's going on. Everybody thinks that more data is better. Well, it could be. It's not necessarily true. As a matter of fact, when you're building a model, more data in general means that your model is more likely to fail. And the reason why that happens, we talked about it in the webinar, is that you want a model to generalize well to other data. You want to make a Target shirt that you pick up from a retail store in a large size that fits other people rather than a tailor-made shirt that only fits you and doesn't fit other people. When we talk about the mixed data, we tend to think in terms of, or the way that you'll read about it is you'll hear about there's big data and then there's small data. Well, there's intermediate data. When I build models, one of the things that I do, if it makes sense, if it is in line with the objectives that we've set, there's a median ground. I'll work with the classical, quantitative and qualitative indicators that we talk about, but we'll also use customer service records. Customer service records can be fairly voluminous. They're unstructured, but they give a qualitative top spin to models sometimes that just regular metrics don't deliver. So there is a median ground. But going back to what you said, Eric, the most important thing, and also Patrick said, the most important thing is, does it meet your objective? That's where you start and that's where you end.
Great points. Thank you both. I'm going to lump the next two questions together because they're very much related and they're kind of staged. So Krishnan asks, what is the time period for model development, validation, and implementation? And Robert follows up with a related question on the back end. On average, how long does it take to see benefits from data analysis after the system is implemented and being utilized? So, as us consultants love to say, it depends, right? That's our favorite response. But at least we can back that up with some factors, I think, around what it depends upon. And having the project manager's view, I'll start out with some of these and have Patrick and Scott fill in a little more detail from their direct experience on the front lines. But so, Krishnan, for the time period for model development, validation, and implementation, I mean, we've seen everything from, fire hose running. We need a model to be built yesterday. We have a sense of, what we need to target, and here's the available data. So most of your time at that point, assuming that you already have your business understanding and your data understanding, in hand, that you've been working in this environment, with modern software, you can crank out a model, in a matter of hours with the software, but it's the data preparation that's a big variable. And we don't always, we certainly don't, really endorse the quick and dirty approach. Has a lot of strategic risks to it that you would have heard today. Now, on the other side is when you want to methodically build an internal analytic practice, instead of just building a single car, let's build a factory, and that factory is going to be able to turn those cars out in much more rapid succession and still allow for some agility. And that's going to depend on the experience of your team, the availability of the data. Do we need to build data sandboxes for analytics to be more available? How methodically are we going to step through the process? And it has phenomenal dividends when you spend a lot of time looking across the organization, interviewing the leadership of the various teams that want to benefit from the analytic implementation, and how the results need to be delivered and either to users or operationalized. So a lot of considerations there that can affect the time frame. So I would say as quickly as 3 days if you do the quick and dirty, which is not really recommended, but sometimes you have to run the fire hoses, and as much as 6 months, and that's when there's a blend of consulting and training to help stand up an organization's internal analytic practice. That allows for structured collaboration and skill reinforcement. That would be the right pace to allow an organization to completely inherit a superior analytic practice internally. So I'm going to refrain from answering the second question because I'm kind of being a hog here on the response. So the second part, when I go around to Scott, you're first this time, and Patrick, Krishnan asks, what's the time period for model development, validation, and implementation? Robert then follows up with, on average, how long does it take to see benefits from data analysis after the system's implemented and being utilized? Scott?
Okay, thank you, Krishnan, and thank you, Robert. Both excellent questions. I'll drive a stake in the ground and say that if you have to put a period to it, about 6 weeks to go from A to Z in terms of model development. Certainly, most people think of model development as throwing the data into an algorithm and see what pops out on the other side. But as we've already talked about, most of the time and effort will go into data preparation. But even before you get to data preparation, there's a decent amount of time that you need to spend in terms of setting your objectives and your measurement criteria for success, getting agreement within the organization, and those are critical. If you don't do those things, then nothing else will work. Everything follows through. You'll fail. So if I have to put a time period to it, I'd say about 6 weeks from start to finish. And when I say finish, we're talking about model implementation. Of course, there is a lot of variation around that. As far as the second part of the question goes, it really depends upon the periodicity that's associated with the model application. If you're doing email blasts, for example, you're going to get a quicker response than you would with direct mail. It takes a little bit of time to get the mail into homes and people to think about it. Or if you're doing drug development, you can certainly do a lot of analytics and do some modeling, but it takes a long time to see those results in the field. So it really does vary quite a bit in terms of the application and the industry that you're working within.
Great considerations. Thanks so much, Scott. Patrick, would you like to extend?
Well, the only thing I would add is, when I started doing statistical modeling back in the late 80s, we always had 12 weeks to do a model, start to finish. and then sort of in the 90s it started to go down, to 8 weeks. And now I agree with Scott. I think anyone that is doing a model now, I think that most people would say, yeah, between 4 and, it should really only take you between 4 and 6 weeks to build a model start to finish.
Sure.
And then just to build on what Scott said about the benefits, yeah, I mean, if I'm doing a direct mail model, I mean, gee, I could get a ROI, in 3 weeks after the mail-in, right? That if I used a model to do the mailing, I could see results for that specific mailing. I could get a benefit in 2 to 3 weeks. Or,
that's true.
For other applications, yeah, you might have to wait a year, right? Because the model maybe is only giving you benefits over repeated use of not a one-shot deal.
True. Yeah. No, that's a great consideration, and I should qualify. When I was talking about a few days, I was presuming that it's almost like a cooking show where you've already got your vegetables chopped. Well, how much time to develop the model with modern software?
Sure.
That's in-house. That's nothing that TMA would promise. And you both were nailing it there. We typically have a 6-week turnaround when somebody outsources, and we promise 6. We usually deliver in 4. But if you're doing the whole process the right way, even if it's more on the tactical side with the data prepper and the rest, that's certainly it. So great considerations. At 1:30, we'll do one more question very quickly for Dante. What are suggestions for small wins to build confidence with marketing and sales execs? One quick recommendation I'd have is to consider an on-site half-day presentation from a seasoned presenter, and TMA certainly has a full bench of those. Along with, since the consultants on site for a half day use the other half for kind of an interactive roundtable with the expert to explore a bit more about your environment, your situation, your resources, how viable is it? Is it even worthwhile doing a more comprehensive assessment if you're reasonably at the starting line? But that half-day presentation around predictive analytics capabilities and limitations, the risks and the rewards, and somewhat tailored to your organization with an interview ahead of time, often helps to demystify the capabilities of the technology for leadership. And one thing that I'm not too crazy about, when it has to be done, that's fine, but pilot projects, before you have the benefit of a lot of the information that can come back from a more comprehensive assessment, pilot projects are really taking the worst-case approach. So I think a pilot is going to be fairly crippled in what it can deliver. Now, the good news is what you do get out from a pilot model is typically impressive nonetheless, and it's a worst case. So, once it's built from there, it can really start to ramp up and impress from that point. So if you're going to do a pilot, I would make sure that it's more secretive until you see the results, and are they worth publishing and bringing around to the organization. So I think pilots need to be handled kind of carefully. But the on-site, 3 to 4 hour executive level presentation, I think, is a great place to start, and then the roundtable on-site is my suggestion. Let's start with Patrick this time. What's your suggestion for small wins to build confidence with marketing and sales?
Well, I don't really have too much to add on that, Eric. I think you've got the last word on that one.
Okay. I know I have a bad habit of capitalizing a bit. I apologize for that. Scott, anything to add?
Well, I would underscore some of the things that you're saying and flesh them out just a little bit more. One of the things that you need to do once you get some introduction to what the risks and rewards, as you were speaking about, predictive analytics, Eric, is to pick that pilot project, but I would not recommend initially that your first pilot project is done by somebody who is not familiar with building models and does not have the experience. That's kind of a recipe for not achieving your objectives. So for your first model, I would either have somebody looking on my shoulder and mentoring me, or I would outsource it altogether. And what you really want to do is you want to pick a project that is, as you mentioned earlier, Eric, the lowest hanging fruit. Not all modelings have the same risk or reward profile, so you want to pick one that that has the greatest perceived benefit and the least amount of risk associated with it. And you also want to make sure that you've got the skill set to help you develop that first model.
That's a great point, and that's one of the great values of that comprehensive assessment. It's like the blueprints, but at the same time you do that opportunity identification. Once you look across at the potential projects, once you look at the resources available, you have this cross-section of those that can be prioritized, and then you get the cheat. You get to start with the one that has the greatest propensity for not only success, but the greatest amount of impact, and those that align with the greatest concerns of leadership. And that's, spending that time up front for the strategic design pays phenomenal benefits. And like you said, Scott, how many times we've seen those try to do pilot projects in-house and improperly dismiss predictive analytics and data mining, and then their organization's late to the game, and they have to watch their competitors enjoy the initial benefits. So great responses. But at 35 after the hour, we'd better draw this event to a close, and I'd certainly like to thank our attendees today for your sustained interest and your active participation, and Scott and Tony for your great segments, and of course Patrick's and Scott's valuable and valuable contributions to the Q&A segment. We'll follow up with an email shortly with some resources and suggestions that will hopefully be useful to you, and from there we hope you've offered permission for us to stay in touch through the Modeling Agency's newsletter, and that you'll consider joining us at a public training event soon. And remember to act quickly to secure one of the 4 remaining very early bird 25% discounts for the December Las Vegas production. And if that timing or location doesn't work for you, keep in mind that in Orlando, that event is at a beautiful DoubleTree that's accessible to all of the popular Orlando attractions. And don't forget that your colleagues can join you anytime for up to 30% off. Now, if you don't have a training or travel budget but would like the guidance of a seasoned mentor, you might be interested in the Modeling Agency's Escort on Call program. Escort on Call is essentially a retainer account that provides remote open access to a TMA senior consultant. Simply open up an Escort on Call account, and you've instantly added a wealth of experience and capability to your existing bench without expanding payroll, administrating complicated contracts, or taking elevated risk on larger commitments. We'll get you the answers you want, guide you through it, show you how it's done, implement any data mining tasks you may wish to delegate, and then remain on call until the next time you need us. And meanwhile, when we're not actively working, you're not paying a dime. So a link to the Escort on Call description page will be among the resources included in the follow-up email. On behalf of myself, Tony, Patrick, and Scott, thank you again for attending Data Mining Failure to Launch. Have a very pleasant evening, and this brings the webinar broadcast to a close.